good evening, or good afternoon. This is Elliot Clark. I am the CEO of HRO Today, and welcome to another HRO Today, an educational podcast. We are the publishers of HR Today Magazine, HR Today EMEA, and HR Today APAC, as well as the producers of the HRO Today Forum and educational conferences held around the world. We also manage the HRO Today Association. Today, we're going to talk about something that's on everyone's mind, and that is the talent economy. We've all been hearing now in July of 2022 about the deteriorating impacts of economic forces, but one area of the economy has shown enormous resiliency, and that is the talent economy. In fact, there's 4.2 million less workers now in the U.S. economy than there were 3 years ago prior to the pandemic. So the unemployment rate of those available to work remains very low, and the competition for talent remains very high. One company was predicting that the recruitment of hard-to-fill jobs would continue to be difficult, and that was 7-Step RPO. And 7-Step has perennially been one of the most highly rated companies on the HRO Today RPO Baker's Dozen. So I'm joined today by the president of 7-Step RPO, Amy Bush. Amy, welcome to the podcast.
I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me, Elliot.
Now, Amy, I know you're the president of 7-Step. You've been there about 8 years. You've been president for 4. Before that, you worked for some really big global companies. You were the managing director, I believe, in North America for Alexander Mann Solutions, and you worked for Kelly OCG. So, you've had a pretty extensive experience with some very large brands, and you get a lot of the economic data that's coming in. And is there anything you want to add about 7-Step before I start asking you about the hard-to-fill job phenomenon? Why hard-to-fill jobs are still hard, but is there anything you want to talk about 7-Step before we go on?
I think it's really important to share a little bit about our roots and why we have such a passion around hard to fill or really high value jobs within an organization. And the company began back in 2008, and we come from agency roots. We're part of a larger motion recruitment family with an agency background. And our first RPO client was an insurance company that came to us with a big problem, 5,000 hires, and they needed a really robust and big solution for these hard to fill roles. And we stepped up to the plate and we put out that fire for them. And you fast forward 14 years later, we're bigger, we're more complex with both RPO and MSP solutions, employment branding, and talent advisory. But really the core of all of this is that we're still centered around that harder work or that harder to fill or high value job. It's our roots, it's our core. And so as the economy changes and evolves over time due to health, pandemic, economic, social issues, we're really in tune to that with some solutions to bring along to the table. So this is a topic we're very passionate about, and we're glad to be with you today to talk about it.
Well, and I appreciate you taking part in the podcast. So let's talk a little bit about this. So there's considerable, the mass media is all over this discussion of the prospect of the slowdown in the economy. And we're hearing people predict even a slowdown in hiring due to the deteriorating conditions. But you predicted recently in one of your newsletters that you don't expect that to happen, or at least that you don't expect it to impact the very high demand for hard-to-fill job candidates. So what are the categories or industries, first of all, that you classify as hard-to-fill? Let's define our terms. And why are you sure the market demand for these hard-to-fill jobs will remain high?
Sure. It's a great question. And the first thing I would say is let's talk about first these hard to fill jobs in relation to market conditions. There's really a second category of hard to fill that relates around how companies are responding to the economy and maybe where they're unknowingly making things a little harder to fill than they need to be. But that first category driven by market conditions, I break up into 3 areas. That's the high demand industries that we know about. You hear a lot about technology or IT jobs. We're not seeing a slowdown in that area. And we're not seeing a slowdown because companies are adapting to economic pressures and the way their consumers are choosing to engage, buy, and interact with their business. So tech is maybe the types of tech roles are changing, but technology and IT in general is still holding strong. In those high demand industries, I would also put healthcare. We saw the shortage in healthcare prior to the pandemic. We had a retiring workforce, not enough clinicians especially nurses out there in the marketplace. You add the pandemic on top of that, we've seen a high level of burnout. We're not seeing as many people going through educational programs. And so this area, less people wanting to be in a clinical setting, maybe being in a virtual clinical setting instead, it lends itself to a sharpening or even a tightening of an already constricted labor market. We're also seeing that $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill show some high demand in the travel and construction areas as well. So you have those known industries I think we're all hearing about in the news. The other two categories maybe we're not hearing too much about, and those are emerging industries, whether it's cybersecurity, alternative energy, crypto, and other sort of tech-driven markets. So, a cybersecurity VP or COO of solar operations, you're really going to have to be looking at tangential businesses where they would have experience to bring to these emerging markets and to these new roles. And so where you might have a tightening tech market already, now you're expanding it to these emerging markets, and it's creating even more supply and demand issues. And the last category is demand for leadership. And if you overlap that with a diversity, equity, and inclusion overlay here, you would be pulling from mid-management to pull up into leadership roles, or really having a strategy starting on those entry jobs to pull up into middle management and then leadership to have a diverse workforce. But if you're not hiring a diverse workforce to start with, it's very hard to get there with leadership. So those leadership and especially diverse leadership positions are remaining front and center in that hard to fill category. I alluded before, Elliot, of there's also that second bucket of, things are changing, the economy's changing, and really making it easy for businesses and candidates to find each other. And I think sometimes we're seeing organizations make it really difficult to get hired. And if you do that in relation to these hard to fill categories, you're almost compounding the problem. So maybe that's something we could talk about a little bit more in detail as we move on, but we are seeing some compounding of the problem with certain companies, making it very difficult.
Well, speaking of employee burnout, I'm exhausted just listening to all the challenges you just enumerated. Okay, I may have to retire for a few years and think about whether or not I want to come back. But basically, if I summarize for the audience, what you're saying is everywhere that was really hard before has remained hard. But we've had a lot of people leave the economy. We have new industries emerging, like, as you pointed out, cybersecurity, which is becoming huge, siphoning people out of the traditional IT market. And you've got, the retirements, the burnout, all these different challenges with DE&I. And it sounds to me, I think what you're saying is this is never probably going to get much easier, right? As it's sort of like the underlying thread here is these jobs will always be hard. So I think the question becomes, given that they'll be hard, then what do you do as an employer? What do you recommend, 7-step recommend to any employer seeking to fill these hard-to-fill jobs? How do they successfully compete for such sought-after candidates? And what steps, are you taking or you recommending to your clients so that they can fill these jobs?
It's a great question. And I think the first thing I would say is, as you're looking as an employer out into the marketplace today, it can seem daunting. And really to step back and simplify it a little bit, the first thing that executives or leaders of the organization need to do is really to take these challenges seriously. We saw during the pandemic, as well as even now with the economy going on this little bit of rise and fall nature of cuts within talent acquisition, really downsizing groups or not investing in that technology. And I think if we're living by that mantra that people are our biggest asset, and a lot of these hard to fill jobs are what I was calling high value jobs. They're going to impact the business outcome and the bottom line profitability of the company. We need to make sure that whether it's yourself or you partner with a company like 7-Step that has the resources to focus on this, that TA has a seat front and center around innovation, technology, and ease of use for the candidate. Candidates are in the driver's seat, and we want that experience to be great. So we want that executive team to be sure that they're focused on that. We saw a tremendous amount of layoffs in the space over the past couple of years. We've added over 400 recruiters to our team in 18 months because that's our job, is to scale up and down with people. And it's been an interesting marketplace. I also think that leaders need to allow TA to get really close to the business so that they understand the synergies between what's going on in the boardroom and the C-suite to what's going on with the actual business and what talent is needed where. That map of the talent needs and where they exist and what the ROI is on investing in that, or also the cost of having the job vacant. We did recently do a checklist. I actually wrote a checklist, funny enough, to get intentional about TA and figure out what you need to do first. Do you have a readiness checklist? Do you have the right budget? Do you have the right scalable partner or team internally? But really, it's about understanding your business needs and getting ahead of it with TA. The problem's not going to go away. And so it's an ecosystem of knowledge, advice, and I think the last thing and probably the biggest thing I would say is data. And that might sound funny, like, where are you going with this? But the data will tell you a lot. For example, you might sit there and be looking at a hard to fill job and you keep saying, gosh, and we keep turning it over too, that position's been open and, we have a 200% turnover. Solving the turnover problem might be the biggest issue, not your recruiting path. And how do we stop the turnover? We can also look at data to come in and say, where are the best candidates from? Where are we getting the most performance from? So I do think that as TA and business get closer together, it's going to make for a smarter solution. So really get close to the business problem, get listening, and make sure that from engagement surveys to recruiting research reports to podcasts like this, that you're knowledgeable and that you're overlaying that with your actual data to solve the right problem. It's not just about filling the job at this point.
They're all great points. And, you look at like the PricewaterhouseCoopers CEO survey. You go back 10, 15 years ago, talent wasn't even on the list of the top 5 concerns. Now it's perennially, in the top 3. So I think the C-suite is focused, and I think that being, I love the word intentional about talent is great. And I do think that also, your point is well taken about looking at not just your attraction systems, but also, do you have a problem with specific jobs? All right. You can keep recruiting for bad managers. And the good thing for recruiters is that bad managers always create marketplace by driving out the good candidates you placed. Companies should be looking at employment as a holistic approach. And that's another great point. But I do want you to come back, Amy, to do a follow-up podcast and go over the checklist. I think that's our next topic, is what are the things that should be on your talent checklist? Because I think, there's a lot of insight that you could offer to our audience on that. So if I heard you correctly, these are the things that people should be doing to get themselves ready. These are the things they need to think about and be intentional about, because this hard-to-fill thing will be just hard. And I think hard is the word that keeps coming to mind as we go through it.
I was just going to say that's exactly correct. Know the cost of talent and let's get ready. It's not going away.
It is not. So thank you so much for taking part in the podcast. To our audience, once again, let me thank Amy Bush. She's the president of 7-Step RPO. And listen to her advice. They specialize in hard-to-fill jobs. They are one of our top-rated companies in the HR Today Baker's Dozen. And we're going to have her back to talk about the checklist that you need to attack the world of talent and the hard-to-fill jobs. I'm Elliot Clark. I'm the CEO of HRO Today. Thank you for your time and attention. Amy, thank you so much for taking part in the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, and we will have you back. To our audience, like I said, thank you for your attention, and we'll look forward to you tuning in for the next HR Today educational podcast.